Hey, Larry Vickers here, Larry Vickers Podcast, brought to you by Firearms Trainers Association. And today, it's all about the SR-25, Knights Armament SR-25. I'm going to give you some cool history that almost guaranteed you don't know about with this platform. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about an older one here that's very historically significant, and then the M110 set up here. Okay, SR-25, where did it come from? Well, Reed Knight was always a big fan of the M16 platform. I mean, that's like his number one passion in small arms. I mean, he's a big gun guy. I like Reed. Me and him have talked guns many times. I've been down to his facility to get pictures, especially for AR-15 Volume 1 and AR-15 Volume 2 of our Vickers guidebooks that James Rupley and I work on. Really delve into all that stuff, but he is a serious Stoner guy, Eugene Stoner guy, serious Armalite guy, serious M16 guy. Probably has the number one M16 style rifle collection in the entire world. So he had a chance to collaborate with Eugene Stoner back in the day to make essentially a modernized AR-10. So what does that mean? Well, what it was, one of the first guns Armalite did with Eugene Stoner, they did a 7.62 NATO battle rifle known as the AR-10. All right. Interesting design in many ways, very lightweight design. Aluminum was used, polymer was used, or fiberglass and whatnot. You had basically synthetic stocks and handguards, very lightweight gun. They had a few different flavors of them, a few different variants of them. Never really caught on that much. Very limited usage. They saw a little bit of contracts here and there around the world, Sudan, Guatemala, Portugal, but they never really caught on because remember, they were coming to the table the same time as the FNFAL was really dominating the world market, and second to that was the G3. And it's kind of whatever the FAL wasn't getting, the G3 was getting, and guns like the AR-10 or the SIG 510-4 were kind of picking up table scraps. Therefore, the AR-10 never was really able to mature. Innovative design had a lot of cool features going for it, but it was just not anywhere near as mature as the FAL or the G3. So fast forward many years down the road, M16's been highly successful, essentially a scaled down version of the AR-10 into the AR-15, much smaller micro caliber, if you will, in 223 Special, later 223, and later 556. And it's been very successful. Reed Knight hooks up with Eugene Stoner. He's like, why don't we revisit the AR-10? Let's bring it to life and revisit this particular one because one of the things that the AR-10 had going for it, very inherently accurate weapon. Partially due to the direct impingement gas system that they got from the French. Now, what that is, real simple, and the AR-15, M16, M4s had this more or less since day one, but there's a gas tube that taps off gas at the gas block up here, and it goes all the way back and expands an expansion chamber in a bolt carrier group in the receiver. And then once it expands, it starts to push the bolt carrier to the rear, which unlocks the bolt and cycles the action. What it does, there's really no moving parts to it. You don't have moving parts like you see with a gas piston setup with like the M14 per se or the SVT-40, so you don't have near the vibration, and it made for an inherently accurate weapon. The problem is it's also very ammo sensitive because with a gas piston gun, the gas piston's placed up here. All the gas has to do is come off, tap it off, and push the piston to the rear, which pushes an op rod of some kind or a recoil spring activated op rod like on the HK417, and that pushes the bolt carrier group. So you don't have to run the gas all the way back to the bolt carrier group in order to get it to cycle. So it's very ammo sensitive, and it's very ammo sensitive in terms of the pressure that you have at the gas port. Okay, and if you have different barrel lengths and that gas port is in different spots along the barrel based on the barrel length, it can, at the end of the day, it can be a nightmare to keep that running. So the direct impingement gas system on the M16, the full-size rifle, pretty well balanced. They've pretty well got that nailed down. Those guns work pretty damn good. Like my buddy Hackathorn and I, that full-size M16 AR-15 platform, that's a good gas system for it, and they run good. When you start to shorten that, or when you start getting in other calibers like 7.62 NATO, you can run into problems. And it becomes a much trickier system to get to function reliably. Another thing they did on the SR25 is they wanted as many reverse compatible parts with the M16 family. All right. So they did a lot of things reverse compatible that you look in hindsight, you go, man, I don't know if that was a good idea, like buffer tube. All right, good example. They have a buffer tube size, which is the same as the 5.56 M16. Now remember, the original Armalite AR-10 had a much bigger buffer tube and a much bigger diameter buffer. So they did reverse compatibility on this for the M16, the little brother to the AR-10 and the younger brother, but the far more widely accepted younger brother, the far more widely distributed younger brother, and also the far more widely developed and perfected younger brother. So their theory was, let's take some of these parts and integrate them in a reverse engineering capacity. The problem is when you did that, they kind of painted themselves in a corner in a few areas. All right, and I've even talked to Trey Knight, Reed's brother, or excuse me, Reed's son back in the day, and he said, you know, in hindsight, we should have stayed more in the original AR-10 format and really tried to perfect that gun in that format instead of worrying so much about being reverse compatible with M16 components. And I agreed with him. Interestingly enough, fast forward to HK, when HK did a 7.62 NATO AR style rifle known as the HK417, also the G28, and now the U.S. Army's adopted it as the M110A1, essentially the replacement for this. They used the standard AR-10 because they really didn't have SR-25s to modify and work on in Germany, but they had AR-10s. AR-10s are relatively available in Europe, so they had AR-10s to modify and work on, and that's what they stayed with. That's hence why you see a bigger buffer tube, and they didn't really get off the beaten path trying to make their 417 reverse compatible with an M16. Yeah, there's some reverse compatibility with the HK416, like with the pistol grip and stuff, but largely it's a gun like the buttstock, buffer tube, that stuff stands on its own. It's not a real large reverse compatible gun. Knight's Armament went down that path and they kind of painted themselves in a corner. Now, another thing that has haunted this platform from the start that HK kind of got around because they just designed their own mag. Reed Knight decided to take the original AR-10 magazine and get it to work. All right, that was his goal. And they have been beating their head against the wall more or less ever since with that. Why is that? Because that original magazine was never really perfected. The other thing is, my buddy and I, Hackathorn, have talked about this. I think this is a good theory. Me and him have bounced this around. I think Eugene Stoner kind of came from that part of the Army where magazines for service weapons were semi-disposable. And he saw magazines for weapons like the M1 carbine or the M2 select fire carbine or the BAR. And if you look at those magazines by their contemporary standards or other magazines, they're not real heavy duty. They're almost a magazine you're going to use a few times and then you're going to throw away. And Eugene Stoner probably imprinted on him at that time frame. And later on, when you look at some of the stuff he did with like the Stoner 63, very good magazine, but he kind of copied in many ways the AK mag. All right. But when you look at the mag they did for the M16 and the mag they did for the AR-10, it almost has that flavor of a quasi-disposable limited use magazine. And that certainly was the case with the M16 AR-15 back in the day. They never intended that mag to be used for very long. Theory was you'd use it a few times and then you're going to pitch it and get a new one. Very much along the lines they did with the M1 carbine. My buddy Hackathorn had talked to some World War II vets and he said once a week, M1 carbine mags were everywhere, brand new in the wrapper. Once a week, they'd go get them. They'd throw away the old ones, put ammo in the new ones, and they'd drive on. So my guess is his mindset was kind of in that direction. So when they made the AR-10 magazine originally, it wasn't really made a mag. It wasn't really designed as a magazine. It was going to be a long-term use, durable mag. So when Reed Knight decided to use that mag in the SR-25, he didn't realize he painted himself into a corner that really came back to haunt him. Because he's been quoted. He told Bob Landis this because Bob Landis ended up making a magazine for his version of the semi-automatic BAR. He made an extended higher capacity BAR mag, and he Reed told Bob Landis, hey, you think it's tough designing a gun? Try designing a magazine. And there's a lot of truth in that. That magazine has to be dead nuts, because you got to remember, it has to be able to push that round up when it's dirty, dry, sandy, wet. It's got to be able to push that round up in a blink of an eye and get it in line to where it can be fed into the chamber. So fast, remember, those guns cycle so quick, you can almost can't see it with the naked eye, and that round has to be able to get fed up in that magazine so it can feed into the chamber in the worst possible conditions. It is not an easy thing to do. That's why you hear people say in the firearms industry and in the gun design business, you start with a reliable magazine and then you build a gun around it. That's how you do it. So unfortunately, Knights Armament, they picked a magazine that was kind of inherently flawed, and they've had many redesigns of that magazine over the years, many. It's kind of hindered them from the start. HK, on the other hand, they developed their own magazine. They had no allegiance to the original AR-10 magazine in any way. They developed their own polymer mag that in many ways was kind of a G36 mag with that smoky green look. On 7.62 NATO. It's kind of a bulky magazine, but super reliable, and it doesn't have the lugs on the side that the standard G36 mag has, but it's a bigger, bulkier mag made out of polymer and works very well, because they realized, hey, we need to design a good magazine for this and not be a slave to the older mag that the original AR-10 had. All right. Now, this is a gun that I bought from a good buddy of mine that I was in Delta with. His name's Jim. I'm not going to tell you his last name. Good dude, real good dude. I was in the A Squadron with him. And what you saw is, over a period of time, the unit would trade their SR-25s back to Knights Armament, and because Reed would be like, hey, I put a bunch of changes and incorporated a bunch of upgrades in my SR-25. Why don't you let me swap out the guns you got, and I'll give you the latest and greatest, and you can just trade your other guns in to me. And which was great. And then Reed, to his credit, would give the guys in the unit first opportunity to buy the guns. They'd say, hey, the guys who use these guns, I'll sell them to you, bargain price, and it was a great deal. And the smart guys in the unit bought them, all right? And then I ended up getting a couple of them for my collection. They're in the Vickers Guide AR-15, I believe, Volume 2, Vickers Guide AR-15 Volume 2. You're seeing this gun and another Delta Force SR-25. Now, here's the story on these. At the time, you're talking about Panama, Desert Storm. The unit was using bolt guns, Macmillan 308 bolt guns, and accurized M14s, essentially national match M14s, where a lot of guys camoed the stock, with camo paint, and then they would have an optic mounted on it. It was never a great solution. They're accurate guns, they're reliable, they had good triggers. Here's the problem. The M14, just like the M1 Garand, was never really designed properly to mount an optic. It was always an afterthought. It was attached to the side of the gun, had a little thumb screw down that would tighten down. The other option you had, depending on the design, is the stripper clip guide in the upper part of the receiver, but would be replaced with a piece that would allow another portion of the mount to screw into. It was never a great idea. And then they would mount an optic on top of that. On top of that, there's never really a good way to mount a bipod. And on top of that, if you wanted to mount a night vision device or a laser or something, there was just never a really good solution to do it with the M14. The M14, from a developmental point of view, didn't leave you a lot of opportunity down the road to customize the gun, to modify it, and really make it what it needs to be. The unit saw the SR-25 and the way it hinges open. All right, hinges open in what we call the shotgun format, like an M16 or an M4 or CAR-15, hinges open, and now guys can clean the guns easier. Now that upper receiver stays together, the optic stays on it, they can get inside and maintain the gun. There's a lot that it brought to the table, so they were like, oh yeah, we need to check these things out. Well, they got some of the early SR-25s, and here's the thing. Cool guns, they were accurate, they weren't reliable. They were not a perfected gun. All right, the unit kind of got them early on and took a look at them. They liked what they saw, but the gun's got to go bang. At the end of the day, the gun's got to go bang. So they went to Reed and said, hey, Reed, we like your gun, and we're interested in kind of developing it and pushing things down the road with it and starting to use the gun, but we can tell you right now, here's a list of things that you need to fix, or we're not going to use it anymore. So they gave him a laundry list of like 10 to 12 things that he needs to deal with and fix with this gun. And Reed, to his credit, stepped up to the plate, had Knight's Armament step up to the plate and put the time and energy and resources into perfecting the SR-25. Different barrels, different rail systems, because remember the early SR-25s came with a fiberglass free float tube. Just more functionally reliable, better magazines, just different things with the gun to make it more reliable and more combat ready. Because early on, honestly, it was kind of designed as a, competition rifle or whatnot, a bit of a range toy, if you will. It wasn't really designed as a serious battle rifle. That's kind of something that came on later, and Reed had to redesign the gun and really put his head into, hey, there's guys going into harm's way with this thing. I need to make this thing work, period. So to his credit, big developmental process, and you see it with this gun. All right, this is an earlier gun, obviously been camoed. This has an upper receiver on it that Jimmy only deployed with a little bit. Now this lower seen a lot of time overseas. He used more of a 16-inch carbine length upper on it, which was more or less camoed to match. He told me he probably only ever used this upper a couple times in harm's way, whereas the lower was used a lot, and it was personalized for Jimmy as well. You see the grip, personalized, the magazines got tape on it in paint. You see he has a bit of the remnants of an old cheek piece that he attached to it here. You got camo paint, so it's a real heavily personalized gun. The lower receiver, that is, and buttstock. The upper receiver is pretty much as it came from Knight's Armament. Now, notice LaRue rail on it. Wasn't uncommon. The arms room would get different rails. They would get different scope mounts. They would get different things and try to different pistol grips. This is a non-standard pistol grip. That's not what came from Knight's Armament. So they would get different stuff like that and put it on the weapons for the guys to try. It could be an R&D thing, research and development thing, could be a test item, it could be something that a guy wanted to try. So that's why you're seeing a LaRue rail on here. It didn't come from Knight's Armament that way, but that's what we got going on. Barrels was a big deal. Most of the time in the unit they used them and they didn't have flash suppressors. All right, but you did have the interface for a suppressor, which you can see up here and you'll also see right here. They had an interface for a Knight's Armament suppressor on the gun, but generally you didn't really see them with flash suppressors in the unit, by and large. If you look at the two guns, this one and the other one that's in the Vickers Guide AR-15 Volume 2, neither one of the guns had a flash suppressor. Also had different barrels. This is a chrome moly barrel. The other gun in the AR-15 Volume 2 Vickers Guide has a stainless barrel that the guy, his name was Dave, good dude in Delta Force, buddy of Jim's. He tried to spray paint in camo, but nothing would ever stick to the stainless barrel. And that's why when you see it in the book, that's why you see it the way you do, stainless with a little bit of remnants of camo paint on it. Reed tried different barrels over the years with the unit to get the guns to really shoot. At one time, they fluted the barrels to lighten the weight. Didn't work. Reed swapped all those barrels out. I remember I visited down there one time and I saw in a cage all these fluted barrels laying around. He goes, yep, those didn't work out. We took them back, replaced them. So that's something. The unit was a giant R&D facility. I shouldn't say giant. It's not giant by any means, but it was a excellent R&D facility for Knight's Armament to get this gun where it really needed to be, to perfect it, to make it reliable, make it consistently accurate, and help develop those magazines. Okay, fast forward to this now. Once the gun was to a certain standard, you saw the Navy bought it. All right, Mark 11. Okay, Navy used it, the SEALs used it and whatnot. And then once it went past that, the Army adopted it as the M110. And that's what you see here. This is a gun in a lot of ways was kind of the pinnacle of what Knight's Armament brought to the table with the SR-25. You can see Leopold scope. Now back then here, one of the things that the unit really started using heavy duty was Schmidt and Bender. I was involved with that back in the day. They really started getting heavy into Schmidt and Bender back then. Don't know where they're at right now optics wise. I don't know if they're using Schmidt and Benders or not anymore. But during this time frame, you're talking about early GWAT, early global war on terror. You're looking at a gun here that was running a Schmidt and Bender in Jimmy's hands on this particular upper. Now you go to the Army M110, Knight's Armament M110, you got Leopold, all right? Scope mount on both of them, or Knight's Armament. Now we've got a rail system here that's a Knight's Armament rail, unlike this test item or one-off on the SR25 LaRue here. Also, quick detach suppressor, very long, very bulky, very heavy, but the M110 has a flash suppressor on it, whereas this earlier SR25 does not. Buttstock here, very similar, except this particular buttstock has an adjustable length of pull. You have the ability to adjust the butt length to make it a longer length of pull. M110 ambidextrous lower here, so you've got a bolt. You got a bolt hold open device on this side that's ambi for left or right hand use, and you got another magazine release here on this side. Knights Armament was one of the first AR manufacturers that really brought the ambidextrous controls into the play, particularly on the lower receiver. Earlier SR25s didn't have it. All right, later ones do, and there are other AR-15 style guns, and 5.56 also have the ambi controls on the lower as well. Match trigger, which Knights Armament was one of the first companies to have a match trigger. Both these guns have it. You can see up here a Harris bipod with a Knights Armament attachment device for the Picatinny rail. This also has, this is part of Kyle Sweet's collection, this also has a night vision, a Knights Armament quick detach night vision device that he put on front of the optic. So M110 here, more or less as issued to the U.S. Army, very much a product improved SR25. You're talking about many years down the road, many thousands of rounds, a lot of time and effort and R&D that went into this gun that really started back in the day when Delta stepped up to the plate and told Reed, they kind of held his feet to the fire, and he's the first one to admit that. When they stepped up to the plate and said, hey, if you want us to use your gun, you're going to have to fix it. And that's what this gun represents. And now we fast forward, and here's kind of the pinnacle of the SR25 and the M110. One of the things they really had to nail down with both of the guns is that direct impingement gas system. It is easier to make the gun functionally reliable with a gas piston system. Interestingly enough now, that's what HK did on the 417 and the G28, and a shorter version of the G28 is what replaced this in U.S. Army use as the M110A1. So HK kind of cracked the code on making sure that gun was not only reliable, but accurate with a gas piston system. Conventional wisdom would kind of tell you don't want to go down that path. You don't want additional harmonics out here by the gas block of the gas piston and the pusher rod and everything. Let's go ahead and use a direct impingement system where there's no additional harmonics, and all we're doing is funneling that gas all the way back to the bolt carrier group in the receiver. But HK, to their credit, nailed it down. They got the gun functioning reliable and super accurate. So they ended up winning the contract to replace this gun in Army service with the M110A1. Okay, question was here by my buddy Justin running the podcast was, what was the reaction of the SR25 to the Delta guys in the unit? What did they think about it? It basically boiled down to this. Everybody liked how accurate they were. Generally, it's always been an accurate gun. The AR-10 M16 platform is an accurate rifle. It always has been. It's kind of like the Accurized 1911 in that sense. Accuracy is really not an issue with that gun. Accuracy, it really isn't an issue with this. They've always been more than combat accurate. The issue's been combat reliability. And where we saw the thing go in the unit was they kind of got it sorted out with this full-length gun. But over time, this gun becomes too big. And the natural evolution is to shorten it. Hey, we want a shorter barrel. We want a collapsible buttstock. Because even these guys, the snipers, may have to clear buildings on occasion. And imagine rolling into a building with a gun this size, or heaven forbid, a gun this size. That's not going to work. So the theory is, hey, let's get a shorter barrel. Let's get a retractable buttstock. Let's make this thing more compact. That's when they started running into problems with this particular platform. Major issues when they tried to make the gun more compact and get it down into almost an M4 style weapon, but a more, not necessarily that small, but taking that gun like the M16 or AR-15 and then taking it down to a shorter, more of a carbine format, if you will. When they started doing that with the SR-25, they ran into real problems. And Reed, I remember one time I was talking to him earlier in the day, and he goes, yeah, because I was like, hey, I want to get an SR-25, and I was thinking about which one I wanted and this and that and the other, and he goes, you want a full-size gun? He goes, because I've kind of zeroed in on the carbine, because the SR-25 in the carbine format has always been a sexy gun and still is to this day. But he's like, hey, that gun's not ready yet. because you don't want one of those. We're still working on that. It's not ready for prime time yet. And the unit saw that. So after a while, to their credit, Knights Armament by and large got it sorted out. I remember I did a battle rifle class. It goes back a few years. Down there, Knights Armament hosted me. And we had about a dozen guys there. A majority of guys shooting SR25s. Had a guy shooting a SCAR. Had a couple guys shooting a couple different guns. And the Knights Armament guns ran like a champ. Even had guns with a carbine length, and by and large they ran good. So to their credit, they really put the time and effort into making that carbine size gun in the SR25 much more functionally reliable. But that was the feedback we got early on when the unit was using these things. We got to get these things functionally reliable, because remember, they were coming from the M14. And say what you will, the M14 may have a really lame ass way to attach a scope. You put a bipod on it. It's just, there may be a lot of things about that particular gun you're not real wild about in terms of accessorizing it or customizing it, if you will. But one thing nobody's ever complained about on the M14 is it's not reliable, because they're a very reliable weapon. So the unit was coming from an M14, super reliable gun, and then going to this gun, which had a lot of features, very accurate, mounts optics well, easier to maintain, but had real functional reliability issues. So that's why they were really dead set on, we got to get this thing more functioning reliability. That's priority number one. So who used these guns in Delta was really the snipers. I was on the assault side of the house and never transitioned to the sniper, so I really didn't have access to the SR-25. Talked to guys, obviously, in the sniper troop that used them, gave feedback. I was a gun guy, so I'd talk to guys there, but also talk to guys in the arms room, and we would talk through the nuances of this particular weapon system, as well as many others. So I knew what was going on with the gun. Interestingly enough, I remember we visited the British SAS one time, and I saw in their arms room, even the assaulters would have access to, 7.62 guns, in many cases G3s, which I thought was interesting, since the British military had used the L1A1 for so long. And they may have had L1A1s in the mix, but I would see a significant number of G3s, and I would be like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Why would their assaulters need a 7.62 gun? Well, found out when we went to Desert Storm. 5.56 M4, or at that time, 5.56 carbine, or a Car 15 is great, but it's a 200-meter gun. Now I'm in the desert and I can see somebody 500 or 600 yards away, and I really can't reach them with my 5.56 gun. And I went, okay, now I got the message. The SAS guys had 7.62 guns to issue everybody, so when they started doing desert ops, they had something that could reach out and touch somebody at 4, 5, or 600 meters, unlike their 5.56 guns. So that was a real wake-up call. And being able to issue everybody a 7.62 gun, maybe not on this level, but certainly a 7.62 gun that would take a red dot sight or a low-powered magnified optic, is something that you wanted to bring to the table. So that was something I believe was developed later on, while after I left, but that was a little wake-up call when we got in Desert Storm and we're out there with 5.56 guns that are 200-meter guns, and we're having to be able to, being able to engage somebody at 4, 5, or 6, or 700 meters away. All right, let's talk a little bit about the collectability of Knights Armament stuff, which has really come on strong now in terms of collectors and guys that want to get some of that early GWAT hardware, of which Knights Armament was very seriously involved with. And I'm going to talk about this SR-15 here and use this as an example. Now, this is a gun where they made it a limited number, right around 100. It's a Magpul Dynamics limited edition carbine. What it's got, though, is a few things on it now that are seriously desired on the collector's market. For instance, this muzzle device up here, I've been told by Justin, in new condition goes for 1,000, used condition goes for 600. They hardly ever made them. They were very difficult to make. You can hardly ever find them. That's a serious collector's item that people are willing to pay serious money for. Bounce back to the rail, same thing on the rail system. They didn't make a lot of them. By and large, they were on these guns. They only made a few extras. Now these things go for serious money. All right, look at the dimple barrel. This is a good example. Knights Armament is always a company that had kind of pushed the edge. And it was always experimenting with different stuff. In some cases, the stuff worked out. In other cases, it didn't. They might have made a scope mount or some kind of a flip-up sight or whatever, where they only made 2 dozen of them or 100. They decided to go in a different direction. Now those items are big money on the collector's market. Interestingly enough, at Delta, we would see a lot of this stuff. We'd see something come in from Knights Armament. It might be, you know, a scope mount, or it might be some kind of a new, you know, doodad for, you know, we'd look at it and, oh yeah, that's cool, or a new flashlight mount, or God knows what, and we wouldn't pay much attention to it. Unbeknownst to us, they only made a dozen of them. They sent 10 of them to Delta, 2 of them they kept, and now when you find those things on the open market, they're grand. There's a lot of that kind of stuff. They're a serious R&D shop. They've always kind of pushed the edge. Remember, they're the guys that came up with the Picatinny rail free float handguard, which breathed, like Reed Knight told Eugene Stoner, he goes, I am going to breathe 20 years more life into your gun with this handguard. And absolutely did, beyond a shadow of a doubt, if not more than 20 years. It was a game changer. You could argue in many ways the free float Picatinny rail handguard really was the catalyst to so many other modifications and parts and different accessories that came onto the market for this style weapon system, M16, M4, AR-15. I mean, it just opened up Pandora's box, and it really in many ways started with the rail system. So Knights Armament has always been kind of an R&D shop, if you will. They're kind of an R&D shop, and they do a lot of stuff in that vein and kind of limited on the production side. Believe it or not, HK is in many ways the same way. They're really a serious R&D shop that really has limited production on the firearms side. Remember when I visited HK back in the day, I was shocked how small the manufacturing facility really was. They basically set up to build guns, and when they're done building the batch of guns for that contract or for that fiscal year, they tear it down and they build something else. So that's what you see with companies like Knights Armament and HK as well. Serious on the R&D side. That's why you see them now always innovating, pushing the edge, pushing the envelope, and coming out with stuff kind of limited on, in some ways, especially Knights Armament, somewhat limited on the production side. And it's also why you see some serious collector interest, and you see a lot of their rare accessories and rare items go for such big money on the collector's market. Hey, I hope you enjoyed this piece, kind of covering the SR-25, more or less where it started and kind of its Delta lineage, and then kind of where it ended up with the M110, and then also touching on their 5.56 a little bit here, and the desirability and collectability of the various accessories and firearms they brought to the market. Have a good one. We'll see you back here for more Larry Vickers podcast. Stay safe. LAV out.